Oh, motherfucker. Well, I wasn't using that knee anyway, right? Ow. Now the fun question is, where the fuck did I put my cell phone? Oh, right there. So glad this is all being recorded. Thankfully, it's just audio. Jerry, baby, bubble, bubble. Don't dance, don't ask me. Don't dance, don't ask me. Don't dance, madam, with you. My heart won't let my feet do things that they want to do. You know what? You're lovely. You know what? You're so lovely. You know what you do to me. I'm like an ocean wave that's bumped on the shore. I feel so absolutely stumped down on the floor. L is for the way you look at me. O is for the only one I see. V is very, very extraordinary. E is even more than anyone that you adore, and love is all that I can give to you. Love is more than just a game for two. Two in love can make it. Take my heart and please don't break it. Love was made for me and you. Da, 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 da.
Hey man, I'm lost. I keep thinking about all the good times we had. I get shell shocked when the phone rings. Every time someone knocks on my door, my fucking bones freeze. I'm jumping out of my skin, man. I haven't slept since I left training and we went over. I feel like I'm a stranger in my own goddamn home. The flashbacks are so fucking graphic and real. I wish it was all just a nightmare. Maybe I won't wake up.
from the other side of the webcam, I guess. The other side of the webcam, yes. Anyway, I know, I have been remiss in my duties of bringing you the best in gun-oriented news and education. Yeah, all right. But in my defense, the 16th was the day after my birthday, and hangovers suck. And last week, I had a cold so virulent that I've dubbed it this year's plague. So, kind of got a little slack. Before I digress any further, though, tonight we've got the ATF dropping a case against a guy to try to further gun control efforts. Yes, we did cover that on the other show I'm on, Anarchy Among Friends, Roundtable discussion. But I'm going to go into a little more detail here with a few more props. Tony the Tyrant follows through on his tyrannical threats to a certain extent. Fauxcahontas tells a bunch of leftists on campus she'll be even more tyrannical. A Pennsylvania judge strikes down laws passed under a bunch of hysteria. The media proceeds to whine. And, of course, our very, very Florida man of the week. Let's do this. Now, before we get into any of that, I do have a quick PSA. And I have this PSA because I always harp, when I train people on weapons and things, on this idea that an unloaded firearm will very quickly become loaded when you're not paying attention. This is something that needs to be reinforced over and over and over again. And here's why. So, as part of my plan for tonight, I planned on showing you the inside of an AR-15. So I grabbed one of mine and I was going to pull it apart. Now, in order to pull this apart, it obviously can't be cocked. You have to drop the hammer. So before I drop the hammer, I go, well, I need to make absolutely certain that this thing is unloaded. Yes, I checked it multiple times before I put it into the case, but I thoroughly believe in being safe here, so I go ahead and pull that charging handle back, and guess what flew out of the chamber? That's a live round. There's no mag in it. I checked it. My girlfriend checked it before it got put away the last time. We verified we didn't see any brass in the chamber, and yet, abracadabra, all of a sudden it's loaded. Now, if that had been spent brass that had sailed out of there, I probably still would be a little pissed at myself, but it wasn't. It was a live round. Unloaded guns can become loaded very quickly. They're sneaky. And I don't say that to do the same thing as gun grabbers and make everybody think that guns are the super dangerous thing or anything else. I'm reinforcing safety and first principles here. So, had I not pulled that charging handle and ejected that and simply gone to drop the hammer to be certain that it was not cocked and I could get it apart, I would have fired a round in my house. Accidentally. And ADs are pretty much unacceptable and should be pretty much unacceptable for everybody. So that was my little lesson for the evening on weapons safety. Yeah, Hillary Clinton is the ammo fairy and put it in there. She's very sorry to hear of my impending suicide. But you never know. I mean, it's that simple. I've been handling guns for a very long time, and that still happens occasionally, you know? It's always something that can happen that fast, and you never know. And lo and behold, there's a live round. Yeah. And if when that happens to you, doesn't make you shit your pants a little bit, I don't know that I would trust you with a firearm, because that's Yeah, that should make you shit your pants. And it did. It really scared the crap out of me to realize that I had a hot weapon sitting in a case in my house that was not supposed to be hot. It's one thing when it's supposed to be hot. Like, I'm good with that. Like, 12 gauge, that's supposed to be hot. All right, cool. I mean, it's safe. It's unsafe, but it's supposed to be hot. That AR was not supposed to be hot. So, just that quick. Things like that can happen. So that's your PSA to start out the evening. But now to get to why we're all here. The news. Some news. So I'm going to start off with why I did that. The ATF's definition of an AR-15 lower as a firearm is in serious trouble, and to protect it, they dropped a federal case for weapons manufacturing and illegal distribution. First, I want to give credit where it's due. CNN's Scott Glover has managed to turn out an excellent article about a fairly arcane aspect of guns and firearms law while miraculously getting the details correct. That's pretty notable for legacy media these days. With that out of the way, the criminal prosecution, aborted though it was, that Glover has written about is worthy of note and could make the ATF's job of regulating AR-15 sales going forward incredibly difficult. The CNN article, by the way, is he sold illegal AR-15s. Feds agreed to let him go free to avoid hurting gun control efforts. If you want to go ahead and Google it and read the original article, which is remarkably well written. Here are the particulars. A Southern California man named Joseph Rowe produced 80% AR-15 lowers and complete rifles, some of which he allegedly sold without a manufacturer's license, and some to prohibited persons. Now, the manufacturer's license is an important thing here, because in order for you to build the guns and then sell them, you have to have a manufacturer's license, not just a license for sale. So it's not like a normal FFL. This is going to be a little different. There's also machine gun manufacturer's licenses, and if you get one of those, let me know, because we're going to hang out. So he also allegedly sold some of these to prohibited persons, people who are not legally allowed to own a firearm. At least a few of the guns he sold were used in crimes, admittedly, including an 80% lower that was used as the basis for a rifle build used in a 2013 shooting spree in Santa Monica. The ATF had been watching Rowe for years and mounted a sting operation against him in 2014. They sent undercover agents into his South Los Angeles machine shop, where he was holding what were basically build parties, where a bunch of people get together. They use the same tools, they take turns, they get one-on-one instruction from somebody who's leading it, they mill out their 80% lowers that they bought, and then they assemble the rifles. Rowe was eventually arrested and charged with running an unlicensed firearms manufacturing operation. Now, the build parties, it should be noted, are actually not illegal. Fun fact. As long as you complete that weapon yourself, that's legal. But I digress. Anyway, none of this is the interesting part to the story. The aspect that's worthy of everyone's attention, and no doubt is giving the ATF nightmares, is the argument that Rowe's attorney made successfully defending his client. As you probably know, if you watch this show at all and are even remotely familiar with firearms, the only part of an AR-15 that's legally considered a firearm is the lower receiver. That would be this bit. That is the only part of the gun that is required, assuming you don't have a can, right? That is required to be serialized and a background check to purchase from an FFL. Now, that doesn't count for private parties in most states, honestly. Or if you're doing, say, an 80% lower. and building it yourself. But that's a different story. It's not what we're talking about here. James Rowe was smart enough to hire a really good attorney, Gregory Nicolason. Nicolason did his homework and actually read the federal statute that lays out what constitutes, legally speaking, a firearm. Almost went out there. But I didn't. As CNN reports, when Rowe's case came to trial in 2018, Nicolason argued that the definition of a receiver under the relevant federal code differed in various ways from the AR-15 component Rowe was accused of manufacturing. Sounds interesting, but here's where this is coming in. Under the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, a firearm frame or receiver is defined as, quote, that part of a firearm which provides housing for the hammer, bolt, or breech block and firing mechanism, and which is usually threaded at its forward portion to receive the barrel. So this would apply to, for instance, an M1, M14 receiver, which is what you're seeing on your screen now if you're watching the video version. It would apply to that. By the way, you can actually get 80% of these now. Fun fact. It would also apply to a Remington 700 receiver, which houses at the front there the trunnion in which the barrel threads. It houses the bolt, as you can clearly see, and it houses the firing mechanism, which is down there at the bottom. Oh, I think I did go out that time. Well, crap. That's what it houses. Okay. Those are, by legal definition, receivers. They house all of the components that make the weapon fire, cycle, everything, right? That is the heart of the gun. Everything else just attaches to it. So the barrel just makes sure that the round goes straight when it comes out of there. The housing, the any kind of wood or anything like that that goes on it is going to simply be there for you to handle it more easily. But the core of the weapon is all right there. Which is why that's the serialized thing. Now, when that code was written, that worked. However, this is an AR-15. It's one of my favorites. This is the lower receiver. This is the upper receiver. Lower, upper, lower, upper. Okay? Now, pretty sure my bolt is forward, but safety first, we're going to go ahead and we're going to double check just because I want to be absolutely certain. All right. Visually check the chamber. There is nothing in there. Hammer should already be forward. So, we're going to go ahead and try and do this without any fingernails or assistance because I'm an idiot and didn't think ahead. Real quick. You know what? I got a round. What am I doing? There's one. Let's go ahead and break that apart. Alright. Because I'm lazy and I don't want to take the whole thing apart. And this is really dirty. Because I haven't cleaned it. But, let's get that in the light here. So, this is the lower. This is what's inside the lower. This is a trigger. Okay? This is a trigger. When I pull that trigger, that hammer comes forward. Ooh, that's dirty. All right, so, right, hammer. That's the part that fires. Okay, that's what's in here. But you will note, conspicuously absent from this part is the barrel. If I were to push this pin out, and I'm not going to because, again, I don't want to have to completely reassemble this thing, but if I were to pull this apart, this is the upper. This is a barrel. This is not part of this. The bolt... Come on, motherfucker. Which is even dirtier. But this is the bolt. This does not go in here. Can I do this one-handed? Let's see how talented Andrew is. Because Andrew would bet you money that he is not talented enough to do this one-handed. Let's see. Can I pull it off? Oh, come on. Oh, no, I can't. Motherfucker. Okay. In any case, now that I've made myself look like a fucking idiot, and got myself excessively filthy with carbon, I'll worry about that later. This nasty, disgusting thing does not go in the lower. This is the bolt, the firing pin, the bolt carrier, the gas key. This all goes in the upper. And Chris, no one asked you. Oh, that's a lot of carbon. It's a black hoodie. No one cares. Least of all me. Low gun oil never hurt anybody, right? Low carbon buildup and things. Okay, so yes. Hey, you know what? I'm doing this kind of haphazard in a really enclosed space. I really don't have much room behind me here. I'm making do, all right? So, now that I've done that for demonstration, you'll notice that the upper can't be called a receiver under that legal definition because it has a barrel and it has a bolt, but it does not have the firing mechanism. The lower of an AR-15 can't be a receiver under that definition because it doesn't have a bolt or a barrel. No, dirty ARs are not the reason they go bad. Fucking AK fans and you're... Yeah, I can fire dirty. Yeah. No, you know what? Drop that in some thick mud, let it submerge for a minute, pull it out next to my AR, we'll do the same thing and we'll see who keeps going. Because I can tell you, not your AK. So, the lower receiver in Roe's case does not have the block, or the breech block. It doesn't have a bolt. It's not threaded to receive a barrel. So it cannot be, by legal definition, a receiver. The upper contains a breech block, a bolt, and a barrel, but not the firing mechanism, so it cannot, by legal definition, be a firearm. Which means that there is no legally defined receiver to an AR. No ARs have that. Most firearms have the, monolithic receiver that meets the definition of the federal law. AR split receiver, upper and lower. Neither component, strictly speaking, meets that, as is explicitly laid out in the law. In effect, Nicolason argued that the ATF's interpretation of federal law that they've been using to deem AR-15 lowers as legal firearms is wrong, and has been since, well, forever. Nicolason called the decision to classify it as a firearm nonetheless the result of, quote, secret in-house decision-making, end quote. Nicolason accused the ATF of abusing its authority by pursuing Roe based on his alleged violation of policy, quote, that masquerades as law, end quote. Again, I love this guy. He's rocking it, right? Roe's case was heard in a bench trial, which was his option, and he chose rather than having a jury because he knew juries could be manipulated, whereas judges, although they can be manipulated, are in this instance much more likely to be convinced. In which only the judge hears the evidence and renders a verdict. U.S. District Court Judge James V. Selna deliberated for a year on this, and then wrote a tentative order in April. To touch on another point in the comments, Jason mentioned that the Mosin is a firearm, as is the AK. Yes, that is true. The AK-47's receiver meets all of the criteria for receiver under BATFI guidelines, as does a Mosin Nagant. The top part of an AK is just a cover. It's not a receiver. It's literally just a cover. So, that is completely accurate to say that an AK is in fact a firearm still under this definition. ARs, however, which are the most popular rifles in the United States, ARs do not meet this definition. In his order, Selna agreed with Roe's argument that the ATF's definition of an AR-15 lower as a firearm is in fact faulty. That no doubt set off alarm bells from LA to DC. If the ruling were allowed to stand, that would set a very inconvenient precedent for them, one that would make AR-15 lowers like any other part of an AR rifle, just another gun part that could be made and sold through the mail to anyone. No serial number, no background check, nothing. The ATF couldn't let that stand. Obviously. Bastards. However, my response on that ruling is, ha ha! So, instead, prosecutors reached a plea deal with Roe. Selna did find that Roe was guilty of selling completed firearms without a license, which would be subjecting him to a possible prison sentence. Following Selna's tentative order, the prosecution and defense agreed to a deal in which Roe would plead guilty to the charge against him, but would be allowed to withdraw that plea if he stayed out of trouble for a year. Prosecutors would then dismiss the case entirely. If Roe abides by the deal, he will have no criminal conviction and serve no time behind bars. And, most importantly, to the ATF, there would be no legal precedent. Because that's how they work. Sources familiar with the agreement said that prosecutors wanted to strike a deal in order to prevent Selna's order from becoming permanent, drawing publicity and creating a case law that could hamper ATF enforcement efforts going forward. Duh. They basically let Roe walk in order to preserve the current fiction under which the ATF regulates AR-15 sales. As for drawing publicity, CNN has done a pretty good job of that with their story. And as Glover points out, Roe's case wasn't the first time a similar argument had been successfully used. Federal law enforcement officials and members of Congress have been on notice about a potential problem with the language in federal gun law as applied to AR-15 since at least 2016. In July of that year, prosecutors in Northern California abandoned, yes, California again, because California, abandoned a case against a convicted felon named Alejandro Jimenez after a judge found that the AR-15 lower receiver he was accused of purchasing in an ATF undercover sting did not in fact meet the definition of a receiver under the law. The ruling and subsequent dismissal drew little notice, but prompted a letter to Congress from then U.S. Attorney General, I realize this is going to be surprising to you all, Loretta Lynch. She's anti-gun? What? I know that that's shocking. She advised lawmakers that the judge's decision was not suitable for appeal, and that if the ATF officials believed the definition should be changed, they should pursue regulatory or administrative action. That case, by the way, was also dropped. So the government has known the ATF is using a faulty interpretation of federal law to regulate the sale of AR-15 lowers for decades now, and the deal they cut in the Roe prosecution doesn't change that in the slightest. Quote, AR-15s as we speak today do not have a receiver by the definition of the existing law, and that's a huge issue for lawmakers, Nicolason said. It shows that the laws are obsolete and they're out of sync with the realities of today's firearms market. Gee, are you suggesting, Nicolason, that lawmakers are out of touch with the market? What? Again, I know that's shocking. Adam Winkler, a UCLA law professor, offered a similar assessment. When he was first informed of the judge's tentative order by a CNN reporter, Winkler said, I thought the logic was crazy, but after reviewing the order and several findings in the case at the request of CNN, I found that Selna's rationale appeared legally sound. It does seem like there is a problem, Winkler said. Gee, you think? The only way to fill that gap would be through new legislation. Congress alone can change federal law to define a frame or receiver in such a way that an AR-15 rifle is covered. That's why Attorney General Loretta Lynch wrote the letter she did way back in 2016, suggesting a legislative fix. But Congress just shrugged that off, which is a good thing. Under a legal principle called Chevron deference, federal courts give regulatory agencies like the ATF pretty wide latitude in interpreting and enforcing Congress's often incredibly poorly written laws. Now, I do want to diverge momentarily, having brought that up. I want to talk about Chevron in detail because I've brought it up before, and it may not be entirely clear to a lot of people. So I said I was going into detail here. That's what I'm doing. So, the Chevron deference is a term that was coined after Chevron v. Natural Resources Defense Council Incorporated. It was a landmark case, 468 U.S. 837. It dates to 1984, in case anyone's curious. It refers to the doctrine of judicial deference given to administrative actions. So, basically, judges are saying, well, the administrators get to decide this. In Chevron, the Supreme Court set forth a legal test as to when the court should defer to the agency's answer or interpretation, holding that such judicial defense is appropriate where the agency's answer was not unreasonable, so long as Congress had not spoken directly to that precise issue at question. The scope of the Chevron deference doctrine is that when a legislative delegation to an administrative agency on a particular issue or question is not explicit, but rather implicit, a court may not substitute its own interpretation of the statute for a reasonable interpretation made by the administrative agency. So, when a law is not completely explicit and detailing this thing, and when it's not doing that and it's simply saying, this thing in general, people know, it leaves it up to interpretation by the agencies tasked with enforcing that law. And a court can't overrule the regulatory agency. Now, I've spoken multiple times, both on this show and on Anarchy Among Friends, and I think I mentioned on a couple other podcasts I've been on. This is a really dangerous ruling, but this doesn't apply here. But Justice Stevens wrote in Chevron, rather, when the statute is silent or ambiguous with respect to the specific issue, the question of the court is whether the agency's actions were based on a permissible construction of the statute. The Chevron deference first requires that the administrative interpretation question was issued by the agency charged with administering that statute of being construed. Accordingly, interpretations by agencies not in charge of that statute in question are not owed any judicial deference. So the FDA doesn't get to rule on alcohol, ultimately, interpretively, because they're not tasked with that, the ATF is. At least that's the way it's supposed to be, in according to Chevron. So essentially, if some agency that had, was charged with regulating nothing but tires tried to regulate the mufflers on a car, and then you challenge that in court, Chevron wouldn't apply, is what that means. Because they're not supposed to be in charge of that anyway. The Chevron deference requires that. Accordingly, also the implicit delegation of authority to an administrative agency to interpret a statute does not extend to the agency's interpretation of its own jurisdiction under that statute. So they can't just decide that they also get to regulate this thing unless they are given by lawmakers that ability. Which should also call into question quite a few things that I'm sure you're aware of. Generally, to be accorded Chevron deference, the agency's interpretation of an ambiguous statute must be considered permissible, which court is defined to mean rational or reasonable. In determining the reasonableness of a particular construction of a statute by the agency, the age of that administrative interpretation, as well as congressional action or inaction in response to that interpretation at issue, can be used as a guide. If the Congress was aware of the interpretation when it acted or refrained from action, and when the agency's interpretation is not inconsistent with the clear statutory language. I realize this is a lot of legal talk, but I really wanted to cover this in really hardcore detail. In subsequent cases, since the original Chevron verdict, the Supreme Court has narrowed the scope of Chevron, holding that only the agency interpretations reach through formal proceedings with the force of law, such as adjudications or notice and comment rulemaking, qualify for Chevron deference, while those contained in opinion letters, policy statements, agency manuals, or other formats that do not carry the force of law are not warranted a Chevron deference. In such cases, the court may give a slightly less deferential treatment to the agency's interpretation, giving a persuasive value under the court's Skidmore deference analysis. I'm not going to go into Skidmore. Don't worry. You can Google that. But essentially what this means is, at its core, is that if a law doesn't specify what a firearm is and just says firearm, it's up to the ATF to decide what that means, as long as it is considered generally reasonable and the court decides that it's reasonable. They defer to the agency. However, if that's only if it's that they arrive at that through proper semi-judicial processes. If they simply write an opinion letter, which the ATF is known to do an awful lot, or they have an internal department memo that says we're doing this now, or somebody in charge of the agency has just made that decision, that doesn't count, and the court can call them on that. That's what it means. So, the agency's interpretation of what constitutes a firearm is so clearly at odds with the underlying language of the law, even the Ninth freaking Circuit can't overlook the issue. Nicolason asked the judge to consider recommending the then U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions conduct a review to determine whether there were any similar cases pending around the country or past convictions, quote, sustained on the basis of ATF policy rather than law. The argument at that Roe's attorney employed to get his client a very good deal will no doubt be used by defendants in future prosecutions of the same kind, and should be. This should keep getting brought up. It could also be used by other attorneys trying to reverse previous convictions of those found guilty on similar charges. This is important. It's incredibly important. This is a huge thing, because if enough people can push this and push this and push this, they can render the law effectively unenforceable, because what will happen is if you keep using that constantly and they keep dropping the case, no one gets prosecuted. And eventually they will give up, and they won't even prosecute people unless it's a fully assembled firearm. So, and that also then means that even if you own multiple pieces, they might not be able to even argue that you're in constructive possession of a firearm. Because it is only when they're completely assembled and clicked together that they become a gun. They are not a gun as independent pieces. Just like if you had 50 triggers laying around, you can't say that you're in constructive possession of a firearm. Even if you have all of the pieces that when put together and you have just boxes of those, they can't argue that. That's actually already been established in jurisprudence too. So keep pushing that, because if you keep pushing it, we might actually be able to get around some shit and really start to cut them down. I mean, I still think that everyone should just live the way you're going to live, regardless of what the law says, but if you can beat them at their own game, that's satisfying. And helps to destabilize their power, which is the core issue here. Destabilizing their power, the regulatory agency's power, eliminating the people who really run the government, which are the bureaucrats, not the elected officials, as much as people want to pretend. So, but moving on, we're going to pull it back to my home state of Wisconsin to go ahead and talk about Tony the Tyrant. Tyranny, it's great! Yes, Tony the Tyrant, Evers, calls for gun reform special session. I told you about this a while back, that he said he was planning on doing this. And he has. On October 21st, Governor Tony Evers issued Executive Order number 54. That's right. Force people to do things by stroke of the pen. Because that's not tyrannical at all. Calling for a special session of the legislature on November 7th to address gun violence. The executive order directs the legislature to consider two bills, a red flag law and universal background check requirements. So you have a week, Wisconsinites, to buy every gun that you can get your hands on, private party to private party, right now, before this happens. Now, chances are nothing's going to pass, but just in case it does. LR 433 and LRB 4700, authored by, and I realize this will shock everyone, Representative Melissa Sargent, a Democrat from Madison, and Senator Lena Taylor, a Democrat from Milwaukee. What? They're both Democrats and from the two most left-leaning cities in the state? No way! Would create an extreme risk protection temporary restraining order and extreme risk protection injunction to prevent a person from possessing a firearm if the person is found by a court to be substantially likely to injure someone. Now, we all know how that really goes down, right? It has nothing to do with innocent until proven guilty or due process, as Der Trumpkin, Der Orange Fuhrer so famously said, take the guns first, due process second. So, basically, somebody accuses you of being a danger to yourself or others. They take your guns, and then you get to try and prove that you're not a danger to yourself or others. That's how it works. They can be filed by law enforcement or a family or household member. So if you're a estranged wife, you get in a big fight, she gets pissed off, she decides she's really going to screw you over, and she says, oh, he threatened to kill me with his guns. That's all it takes. Protection order. You lose your guns. You now have to prove that you are not, in fact, a danger. You don't get the benefit of innocent until proven guilty under red flag laws at all. The LR 4698 and LRB 4701 would create a universal background check requirement for the sale or transfer of firearms. As of right now in Wisconsin, if you are buying a firearm from a private person and you are a private person, no background check is legally required. This is in alignment with federal law. No background check is required, which is the way that it should be. I should be able to buy and sell my property at will because it's mine. That's it. It's my property. I should be able to go, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and sell this. And hey, Joe Bob down the street wants to buy it. Hey man, $500. Done. Here it is. Transfer complete. And it's important to note here that even if you institute universal background checks, such as the state of Washington and Oregon have, such as the state of California has, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, I think, does Illinois have universal background checks yet? I think they might. If you look at those states, you'll notice something very important. And that's that the only people who are getting these background checks are people who are law-abiding citizens, who are neither inclined nor likely to commit a crime. The gangs aren't going to be like, yo, homie, I can't sell you this. I got to run you through NICS first. That doesn't happen. And any idiot who thinks that a criminal is going to do that, I have beachfront property near Phoenix to sell them. And on top of that, the majority of mass shooters have never done anything that would bar them from firearms ownership before. The majority of mass shooters purchased all of their firearms with background checks from FFLs. So what do you think you are preventing by making law-abiding citizens have to go through even more to get a gun? You're not helping anything. You're not preventing any of the bad people from getting guns. All you're doing is rendering good people more likely to be harmless. Now, leaders of the Republican majority in the legislature have indicated that they absolutely will not pass the proposed bills. In a statement, Assembly Speaker Robin Voss, who's a Republican from Rochester, Wisconsin, not Minnesota, or New York, because I realize I have people from the East Coast watching, said, quote, "A special session call will not change where my Assembly Republican colleagues and I stand on protecting the Second Amendment rights of Wisconsin citizens. As I've repeatedly said, we will not entertain proposals that infringe on constitutional rights." Similarly, Senate Majority Leader Scott Fitzgerald, who's a Republican from Juneau, said in a statement, after the governor opened the door to a long-term plan of gun confiscation at his press conference last month, it's easy to see how today's action could just be the first step in his attack on the Second Amendment. The Senate will not be part of a drawn-out strategy to infringe on everyone's constitutional rights. The Wisconsin Constitution does allow the governor to convene the legislature in special session, during which, quote, no business shall be transacted except as shall be necessary to accomplish the special purpose for which it was convened. That is Wisconsin Constitution, Article 4, Section 11. However, the governor cannot force the legislature to actually take up any bills. The Senate and Assembly could adhere to the governor's orders and convene by simply gaveling in, then adjourning shortly after without taking up the governor's recommended bills at all. Warren tells the UNH audience that she'll reduce gun violence. We're going to go ahead and just skip right past the rest of that because I don't think that too many of you care about Wisconsin, but I do and wanted to talk about it. You guys talking about people shooting at people in Chicago and Milwaukee, I shot a man in Reno. just to watch him die. Yeah, I went there. It's a Johnny Cash reference, kids. Know your legends. Throat was getting dry. All right. So now, let's move on, as I said, to talk about Fauxcahontas for a moment. Hi, how are ya? Was that offensive? I personally, I think that natives should be far more offended by the fact that somebody who has less native blood in them than the average American has traded on being native for so long. And look at her. Is there anything even remotely native about Liz Warren? Anything? She's the little whitest white girl. I mean, seriously. Throat's still dry. But Democratic presidential candidate Liz Warren, or Fauxcahontas, which is what I prefer, promised a crowd of 625 people at the University of New Hampshire that her administration will reduce gun violence and death from guns by about 80% if she is elected. No. No, she will not. But that's what she promised. The subject came up when PhD student David 50, Tree 50, said he has had no professional training this year as a teacher's assistant, but has had to go through mass shooting drills to protect those in his classroom because I don't want to have to be prepared just in case and learn how to be a sheep because I'm not allowed to be armed. He asked, quote, as president, what would you do to help the gun control situation? End quote. Warren said she will start by doing, quote, everything a president can do all by herself. So she's setting up, I will be a tyrant and rule by fiat. Because if there's another interpretation for that, I don't know what it is. She would go on to say that that means cracking down on gun dealers who violate the law, mostly at the behest of the ATF. I think everyone kind of remembers that. Fast and Furious. And loosening restrictions on who can sell firearms. I don't know what she thinks is loosening. I really don't. I don't know if you've looked at the regulations if you want to get an FFL, but, Warren said, but the big things are going to have to be done by Congress. So how do you make this happen? And the answer has to be repeal the filibuster. No. Quote, on guns, on pharma, on immigration, on all the things we need to get done. So long as there is a filibuster in place, the gun industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the people making money from the world working the way it is have an effective veto. Warren said. Oh God, I cannot laugh hard enough at that quote being said by someone who has been in Congress as long as she has and has made millions from lobbyists for exactly those industries, with maybe the exception of the gun industry. Unless, of course, it's, Springfield or Rock Island. They might have given her money. Fuck them. Warren recall being there when the United States Senate got 54 votes for background checks on gun purchases in 2013, and it failed because it could not survive the filibuster. That's why filibusters exist! During her speech, Warren talked about how corruption has taken over Washington, D.C. What? Oh. Yep. On other big issues, such as climate change. Anthropogenic climate change is a load of horseshit. Anyway, Warren said that in the 1990s, politicians on both sides of the aisle were concerned about global warming. But then the Koch brothers, the petroleum industry, and big polluters came together and protected their profits by investing in bought and paid for experts. You'll also notice here that her immediate response to this direct question about gun control is to steer things to climate change. How dare you? That's exactly how these people work. They're going to try and dance around gun control when they're being asked direct questions, because if they say anything overly tyrannical, they know that their career in politics might be done. Because with as much as the government likes to laugh at the threat of the boogaloo and likes to laugh at militias and pro-Second Amendment people, they are keeping an eye on us because the Second Amendment still exists. And with as much as they pretend to not know why the Second Amendment exists, they know. They know. And they know that that threat is not idle. And they know that it's right there. Right there. And that there are tons of people chomping at the bit to finally remind them how you water the tree of liberty. So she wants to steer this to the Koch brothers and petroleum. That's what she wants to do. She wants to go back to something that she can be a populist about. And just roll with the trend on Twitter. Right? Quote, those bought and paid for experts could build something. They could build an umbrella over all of the politicians who could hide under it and keep taking Koch brother money, petroleum industry money, big polluter money, and say, gee, I don't know, I'm not a scientist. Ah! The irony here is overwhelming, is it not? I mean, one, again, as I previously pointed out, this is in response to a question about gun control, and immediately we're going Greta Thunberg here. Number one. And we're also going to talk about the Koch brothers, but ignore George Soros, apparently. Number one. Number two. She's saying that this is bad because members of Congress might throw up their hands and honestly say, well, I can't make an informed decision because I'm not a scientist. But she is still under the impression, or at least putting forward this face that she's under the impression, that on gun control, she's somehow qualified and an expert. Or third option, what she's saying is, it's okay to make laws on things that you don't understand without all the information. And this is something that Congress does constantly. I mean, I think we all know that, especially when it comes to guns and electronics and really most industries. Because look at the previous job descriptions of people in Congress, right? You're not going to see a bunch of lawyers, or you're going to see a bunch of lawyers. You're going to see a bunch of lifelong politicians. What you're not going to see is a bunch of scientists. More than a handful, if that, of doctors. Remember when Rand Paul said something about, was it Ebola or Zika? That Rand Paul said something, Dr. Rand Paul said something And one of the Democrats said, well, when did he become a doctor? Well, probably when he got his doctorate in, medical school. Probably then. That's when he became a doctor. But it's just assumed, because no one else knows what the hell they're talking about, that clearly he doesn't. And if you had an actual, and this is why you can't work from the inside, because if you had an actual gun expert who somehow managed to get elected, which, let's be honest, will not happen. But if that happened, they're one person who understands guns in a sea of people who don't understand, don't know, and don't care to learn. What are they going to do? Nothing. Instead, what they're going to do is compromise all of their principles over and over and over again in order to try and get even anything forward. And guess what? You don't change DC. DC changes you. And eventually you turn into everyone else. You compromise so much that you no longer stand for what you stood for when you got there. You go with the flow, and you do anything necessary to get reelected rather than standing on principles. So again, you cannot change the system from the inside. You can't. Don't think you can, because if you do, you're an idiot. Warren also talked about her wealth tax, which she says will only apply to households with a net worth of $50 million or more right now. And after that, it will only be 2 cents on every dollar. 2 cents on every dollar. So what that means is that it is a 20% tax. But you know who doesn't do math? College students. Voters. Especially leftist voters. They don't do math. So they didn't sit there and go, but wait. That's a 2% tax per dollar on just the wealth, but then I'm also paying my normal income tax on that, and I'm paying, wait a minute, that adds up to like a 20% tax guaranteed at minimum on my money. Let alone, do they look at the fact that they're already, when you factor in sales taxes and all the other ancillary taxes that are out there, you're actually paying 55%, somewhere in that neighborhood, of your income to taxes. Just right back to the government. So, But they're never going to do that math. They're never going to sit down and look at it because, but the latest episode of The Bachelorette is on TV. But what about Survivor and The Voice? Bread and circuses, my friends. Bread and circuses. Not saying you shouldn't, enjoy entertainment periodically, but the majority of people let it consume them. With the money that she wants to steal from everybody, especially the biggest job makers, Warren said she wants to invest in education. State-run education. The socialist indoctrination camps. Those. What a surprise. That includes universal child care. You'll notice this term, universal, coming up a lot for socialists and communists and things. Universal child care, universal pre-kindergarten, raising the wages of preschool and child care workers for the state, investing in public schools, investing in historically black colleges and universities, because that matters, as well as canceling student loan debt for 95% of people. Now, I realize that canceling student loan debt seems like it's a good idea. Selfishly. Well, I don't want to have to pay for that anymore. I can't even use it anyway. However, one, you need consequences in the world. And two, And I really do mean consequences, because newsflash, they aren't about to open up a new, women's studies factory down the road. Or, there's no giant demand for people with English degrees. Hate to break it to you. There's not. So, what she's talking about is just going, well, all of that work that those people put into educating you in this thing that was useless, right, to begin with. But they put in a lot of work to teach you how to do that. And now they want to steal a bunch of money from people, including those college professors, because college professors get paid a lot. They want to take money from those people and then use that to pay off the money that you knowingly borrowed and just don't want to pay back. The irony is that most of these professors at these left-wing universities support things like this and go, yeah. And don't sit there and go, but wait a minute, I put in all that work and now you're going to steal money from me at gunpoint to pay for the work that I put in. I'm paying myself. Hey, wait a minute. None of these people do that because college professors might occasionally be intelligent. I have met a few. But they are very, very frequently morons when it comes to things like economics. And you know the worst offenders when it comes to economics? Economics professors! There are good ones out there. There are. Don't get me wrong. There are definitely good ones out there. There are some that work, for like the Mises Institute and for fee. There are a few out there. But in general, economics professors, especially left-wing colleges, are idiots. They still believe in the broken window fallacy. They still think that Paul Krugman is somehow like God. They're morons. But I digress again. Members of the audience said prior to the event that education, climate change, and student loan debt were on their minds. What a coincidence! You mean she's pandering? Gosh. For Norma de Rosier of Newmarket, this is one of the most important presidential elections of her life. Gosh, because she's lived through so many. They happen every 4 years. She's in college. Let's do a little bit of math. She has been out to see a number of the Democratic candidates. What a surprise. She goes to a leftist university, wants to see a bunch of Democratic candidates, and said Warren is impressive. This woman is not intelligent. At all. Or particularly well-read, or well-traveled, or well-studied. She's an idiot. Chances are, in a couple of years, she'll either be on a poll to support her child as a single mother, or, potentially, marching in the street, yelling something to do with vaginas, with a brightly colored faux hawk and cat eye glasses, and doing literally nothing to contribute to society, because all she's managed to do is become a barista at a relatively shitty coffee house where she sits around and nags people's ears off about the struggle of women. Quote, I don't think she's very strong, and I don't think she's going to... Or, I think she's very strong, and I don't think she's going to back down if someone attacks her like a child, if you know what I mean. Boy. Strong words. Strong words. This week's trip to New Hampshire was Warren's 20th. She has visited 27 states as well as Puerto Rico since announcing her campaign. In the comments, Jason pointed out that the Massachusetts Senator Fauxcahontas' new plan would be $4.2 trillion per year in additional spending. 4.2 trillion trillion dollars. So that's fun. Yeah, that isn't gonna, do anything horrible to the economy or anything. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? But we move on from Fauxcahontas to a very entertaining subject for me. Judge strikes down gun laws enacted in the wake of Pittsburgh synagogue massacre. Ha ha! A Pennsylvania judge on Tuesday struck down 3 gun ordinances enacted by the city of Pittsburgh immediately after the mass shooting at the Tree of Life synagogue last year, saying that state law prevented the city from regulating firearms. The ordinances, announced in December and covered by me, by the way, go back and watch the show, include an assault weapons ban, a ban on large-capacity magazines, and a measure that empowered courts to stop people from possessing firearms if they posed an imminent threat to themselves or others. That's the red flag laws that we talked about earlier. Go ahead and rewind, Smokey. But Judge Joseph M. James of Allegheny County said in his opinion in the Court of Common Pleas that state law, quote, preempts any local regulation pertaining to the regulation of firearms, end quote, despite the, quote, large amount of energy, end quote, the city put into arguing that its ordinances were lawful. Judge James' decision came just 2 days after the first anniversary of the massacre, because that freaking matters. If you aren't sure what I'm talking about, back on the 27th of October of last year, a gunman opened fire at the Tree of Life synagogue, killed 11 people after the authorities said he had spewed anger towards a bunch of Jews and immigrants online. There's actually a lot of evidence that he was actually pretty left-wing. I'm not going to get into it, but regardless. The decision also came as local officials nationwide are increasingly pushing back against similar state-imposed restrictions on the ability of cities and counties to enact gun control policies. That's right, local officials are ticked that they don't get to rule their little fiefdoms with an iron fist. As of late last year, 43 out of 50 U.S. states had preemption laws that bar local governments from enacting nearly any gun regulation that goes beyond state law. In other words, if the state doesn't say you have to have background checks to own a gun at all, a municipality cannot say universal background checks in this city. Places like Florida have that. Wisconsin has that. There are a lot of states. I'm pretty sure California does not have that. Call me crazy, but I'm just going to go ahead and hazard a guess. Joshua Prince, a lawyer for the gun rights group, or for gun rights groups and others who sued the city over it. I also covered that, if you want to go back and look for that in a previous episode. Don't ask me which one. I don't remember. Said Judge James' decision showed that Mayor Bill Peduto of Pittsburgh, who championed the measures, and the city council are, quote, neither above the law nor a special class of citizens that may violate the law with complete impunity. The city's gun control sought to eviscerate and violate the right of the citizens to citizens of the Commonwealth to keep and bear arms and ensnare law-abiding citizens through a patchwork of uninterpretable laws, he said in a statement Tuesday. The city and its outside legal counsel have always expected this would be a long legal fight and will continue to fight for the right to take common sense steps to prevent future gun violence. Common sense. They always want to bring that up. Common sense. It's just common sense that we need to terrorize the law-abiding citizens in the name of the people who won't respect the law in the first damn place. You know, if laws worked to stop bad people from doing bad things, the fact that murder is illegal would be enough. But it isn't, is it? And if gun laws stop bad people from doing bad things with guns, then explain California or New York or Chicago or New Jersey or Atlanta or most of the Pacific Northwest. Hell, explain Humboldt County in California for me. If you're unfamiliar with that, Google that. They always pretend that it's common sense that you just... No. See, what's common sense is to say that if the Second Amendment names the right that exists, whether the Second Amendment names it or not, of the people to keep and bear arms, common sense says that you don't get to violate that right. That's what common sense says. But apparently, common sense is not so common. Anyway, Tim McNulty, who's a spokesman for the city, said that in an emailed statement on Tuesday night, "We will appeal." The measures were announced in December and immediately faced pushback from basically every gun rights group in the country. In January, the Allegheny District Attorney Stephen Zappala wrote a letter to a city council member stating that he did not believe the council had the authority to pass the legislation, and even suggested the council members who voted in favor of it could in fact be prosecuted for violation of the law. Mr. Peduto signed the ordinances into law in April. 3 gun rights groups, the Firearms Policy Coalition, my boys, Firearms Owners Against Crime, and Firearms Policy Foundation. The FPC and the FPF work together a lot, by the way. And 3 individuals in the city of Pittsburgh quickly sued. The Court of Common Pleas stayed the ordinances in May as the case proceeded. In an interview with City Lab in February, Mr. Peduto said he was aware of the legal hurdles the city faced. Quote, "We feel we have to do something to change the temperature in Harrisburg," Mr. Peduto said, referring to the state capital of Pennsylvania. "If this were to be followed by 50 other cities around Pennsylvania doing the same thing, it puts pressure on the state legislators to act. We feel it's worth the legal fight." He said that he believed the United States Constitution gave the residents of Pittsburgh and other cities the right to domestic tranquility that is taken away by gun violence, referring to a line in the Constitution's preamble. The preamble, which says what? The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness. Now, when the Constitution talks about rights, is it talking about government primarily or people? I think we can answer that pretty closely or pretty quickly with the preamble in the fact that it says that people have the right. The people have the right. Not the government, the people have the right to life, meaning the government isn't allowed to just kill them without just cause. I don't think the government has the right to kill them at all, but that's irrelevant. That we're talking about the Constitution, what it says. Liberty, which I think the Second Amendment falls under. And the pursuit of happiness. In what way do any of these things indicate to this tyrannical pile of garbage that people have a right to domestic tranquility? What thing is he trying to cling to in those 3 phrases? Sorry. What is he trying to cling to here? Because I don't see it. And I would wager that no one else does either. Quote, "So there's this realization that it's an uphill battle, but it's a battle that has to happen, and it has to start somewhere," Mr. Peduto told City Lab. "I really do believe it's going to happen by cities saying enough's enough. Your freedoms are just too damned inconvenient. It's time for us to grassroots destroy all of your liberty and freedom and make you a slave in every sense of the word." That's what he's saying. He added, if you're going to try and stop us from doing it ourselves, we're going to go to court and we're going to do it over and over until common sense prevails. You know what's funny? That's the same thing that gun owners keep saying. If you're going to stop us from just being able to be ourselves, we're going to go to court over it and we're going to do it over and over and over until common sense prevails. Or we have no choice but to use the Second Amendment. I love when people say, well, I own guns, I exercise my Second Amendment right. No, your Second Amendment rights are not about owning guns. Your Second Amendment right isn't about going hunting. It's not about getting to choose what gun you own. At its core, your Second Amendment right is your ability to overthrow tyrants. That's what it's about at its core. That's what it's talking about. Whatever methods you use for that are irrelevant. It's saying that the methods that are there, that exist, are protected. You should have the ability to overthrow your tyrants violently. That's what it's about. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise, because they're fucking liars. And their bloodline is weak. Speaking of weak bloodlines, it's time for your favorite superhero to make his appearance again. That's right, Florida Man. It's time for Florida Man. And this one could not get more Florida. It really couldn't. Florida Man tries to get alligator drunk, gets bitten instead. A Florida man was arrested after allegedly capturing an alligator and attempting to feed it beer. According to a report from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, 27-year-old Timothy Kepke fed some beer to a large semi-aquatic reptile after his friend, 22-year-old Noah Osborne, caught the gator, as he told police, quote, with my bare hands. The incident was, by the way, filmed, of these quality individuals molesting that poor reptile. I don't know where the footage is before anybody asks. If you can find it, awesome, send it to me, because I want to see it. Anyway, after Osborne caught the gator with his bare hands, Kepke tempted the animal to bite his arm, which it obliged. The Florida man then allegedly poured beer into the gator's mouth, causing it to act aggressively. Because he turned it into a Partysaurus Rex, motherfuckers! We gonna get lit up in this bitch. I don't know what happened there. That got away from me. I apologize. The two then released the gator, presumably to go tell its friends, oh, you should have been at that party, bro. I totally bit a guy. Yeah. After that, authorities made a visit to Kepke's home sometime later, since the two had filmed the entire incident and presumably posted it online, although it's not clear how the authorities obtained the video. Kepke then admitted he was the man in the video and said while he had been drinking, he was definitely totally not intoxicated. Like, seriously, man, I'm totally sober. I wasn't drunk, really, as I caught an alligator and then tried to get it drunk. Because that's totally not a, hey, man, watch this incident at all. No, he wasn't drunk. He was just a Florida man. Both men were, of course, arrested last Thursday on charges of, this is the charge. I'm not making this up. This is a law that exists in Florida. And this is what they were charged with. Quote, unlawfully taking of an alligator. Not sure what that means. Like, in the biblical sense? Or like, because they didn't remove it. They didn't kill it. I mean, you tried to kill them. But it's... Wait, unlawful taking of an alligator. I think it's one of those incidents where it's like the cops can't come up with anything that's actually on the books that says that what they did should be punishable by being thrown in a cage. So they just throw whatever and hope that it sticks. Chances are, because the letter of that law probably completely has nothing to do with what they did, most likely they're going to get off on this. But... Oh, Jason posted in the comments the link to the video. Apparently it's a very small gator, so, like, probably, you know, it's not like it was going to rip his arm off, because you have to be a complete moron and mess with a really big gator, right? But, I mean, unlawful taking of an alligator just seems like a weird charge. And I feel like if they argued and said, hey, but I didn't take it, I put it back. You know, what I did was catch it temporarily, and really, that's kind of the same thing that, like, wildlife experts do, right? To tag them and stuff, they grab them, and so really, I mean, I what did I do? And I even gave it some beer to calm its nerves after the whole incident. I love that it starts acting aggressively after he pours beer in, though. So, apparently, in case you were wondering, gators are angry drunks. That's the thing you know now. The more you know. Because knowing is half the battle. And the other half is extreme violence. But that's all I got for you tonight. Hope you appreciated my rantings and ravings. If you are watching this video, I appreciate it. Hope you enjoy my quickly whipped together graphics. If you are listening to this, you missed out on the graphics, and for that I apologize, but you get to listen to the dulcet tones of my voice. So you're still a winner. Winner in my book, kid. But I appreciate it. Do not forget to check out Anarchy Among Friends Roundtable discussion on every other Sunday. No longer live, unfortunately, because YouTube sucks sometimes, but uploaded immediately after we record. Recorded live, and regrettably mostly uncut, despite my arguments to the contrary. Jason? Check it out. We're pretty freaking cool.